We're going to talk about campaign finance and more specifically campaign finance reform and some of the attempts that Congress has made over time to reduce the influence of money in campaigns and those kinds of things. There's been a number of things they've tried to do over time, and we'll look at how effective some of those things have been, or maybe how ineffective some of those things have been. So here we go. The first thing we really need to look at is the Federal Election Campaign Acts. And they really dealt with disclosure, subsidies, limitations. Disclosure being when people donate, do you have to provide their names and make public their names so people can figure out who's donating? Subsidies, how much money the government is going to give to certain campaigns and things like that. And then limitations, how much money can people spend or donate to campaigns and those kinds of things. So one of the first things this act did was set up the Federal Elections Commission, where Congress gave themselves the authority to create a panel of commissioners who would then kind of oversee campaign finance and make sure people are following the rules. That would later, and we'll see later in the presentation, that was challenged in court, whether or not Congress had the authority to appoint their own commissioners, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. It also set a limit in terms of disclosure so that anybody who would donate more than $200 to any campaign or fund, their names would have to be disclosed and made public so that way people could track, I guess the idea would be big donors and things like that, and where that, the influence of that money is really coming from. They also had a matching funds rule, which dealt with the subsidies from the government, that presidential candidates can receive federal subsidies on a matching fund basis if their party received at least 5% of the vote in a previous election, and only individual donations up to $250 in that case are matched. Made it really tough on third parties. Most third-party candidates never really ever received 5% of the popular vote, and so it sort of set a limit and really kind of hamstrung third parties a little bit there. Some of the funding of presidential campaigns and the limitations on that you can kind of see here. So any presidential candidates who receive federal money are subject to spending limitations. So in 2004, the number there, the spending limit was 74.6 million, so almost 75 million or less in the general election. Both candidates in the 2004 election declined to accept funds during the primaries and were thus able to spend as much as they could raise prior to accepting their party's nomination. So to give you an idea, Bush spent in that section $264 million, while Kerry at that time spent $237 million. So they were able to spend a lot more money than the limitation set. In 2008, due to inflation and some other things, the federal limit went up to $84.1 million. So John McCain, he raised and spent $219.6 million. In the general election, he accepted public funding and received the $84.1 million. So he decided to go that route. He kind of made a pledge. He also raised $46.4 million for legal and accounting purposes, which is sort of a separate thing. And so he's able to raise a little bit more money that way. In comparison, Barack Obama, he declined all public funding and was free to raise and spend as much as he could. And as a result, the Obama campaign raised $745 million for the primary and general election. So far more money that way by declining to be beholden to these limits from these federal subsidies. So they declined it that way. In 2012, the overall spending, here's just some numbers for you. Obama spent $722.4 million. You can see Romney spent a little more than half of what Obama was able to muster and spend. Johnson, as a third party, you can see how low his number is at $2.8 million. And then the general election limit to receive matching funds at that time had gone up due to inflation and certain things like that. So it had gone up to 91.2. And of course, both major candidates declined. And you can see right here why. Clearly, much more money available if they hadn't have done that. So where do the contributions come from? And who's really doing most of these contributions? A lot of times you think it's got to be some big donors like the Koch brothers and things like that. But when you really look at it, almost $1 billion came from individual contributions. Individual people, from the little guy all the way up. You had, almost $2 million in PAC contributions. So not a whole lot of additional funding there. And then for all candidates combined, so this isn't just the Democrats or just the Republicans. This is a combination of the two. This is a pretty interesting link that you may want to go to where you can actually look at the 2016 results, and you can click and see where a lot, Trump and Clinton and Johnson and Carson and everybody really where they were getting their money from and how much money they were getting from. It's a pretty interesting website, so I'd check that out if I were you. And then we come to our first major court case, and this one really was a case designed to rein in or constrain the acts, the Federal Election Commission acts that were enacted. And so this came down. And so what we got at the end of this is contributions really are more likely associated with a particular candidate, and you are not advocating for everything they say or do. So when we talk about the Supreme Court in this case establishing limits, and that you can do that, what they're really saying is contributions aren't speech in the same way. You're donating to a general person or a general campaign, and you're not really advocating one way or another for what those campaigns particularly say. And so it's a different kind of speech, and it's more related to association rather than speech. And so you can set limits on that. So Congress, or I should say the Supreme Court, upheld putting limits on how much you can contribute to campaigns. But on the other hand, they struck down limits on congressional campaign spending and how much money can be spent. And basically their mentality was spending, since it is a more direct way to communicate a specific message, the court ruled that spending in this form is like speech and therefore can be protected under the First Amendment freedom of speech. Therefore, there can be no limits put on the amount a campaign can spend. And that really opened the door for, war chests becoming these huge amounts, and people not wanting to take the federal subsidies and matching funds and those kinds of things because they were really going to be limited by that. So the effect of Buckley versus Vallejo, which is a pretty important case, set limits on contributions, but no limits on how much could be spent in an election. And so it kind of opened the door, or made firm, that you could spend as much as you wanted, and it really opened the door for money to come into campaigns. So that is into part one. And so I'm going to break this down into two real parts here to make it a little bit easier. So we'll take a pause here.